Paris had survived war, humiliation, and political decay. But in the spring of the 1920s, something even stranger was happening beneath the surface. One of the most famous structures on Earth had become, in the eyes of many Parisians, an embarrassment, a giant iron skeleton rising over a city that preferred marble, stone, and memory. It was expensive to maintain, it was aging, and behind closed doors, there were whispers that the government no longer wanted it. That should have sounded absurd. It did not. Because the Eiffel Tower was never just a monument, it was a symbol. And symbols become dangerous when the people guarding them begin to look weak. France was still recovering from the trauma of war. Institutions looked permanent from a distance, but up close, everything felt more fragile than it should have. Bureaucrats shuffled papers. Contracts moved in silence. Fortunes were made through access, not merit. If something outrageous were to happen in that atmosphere, it would not begin with violence. It would begin with paperwork, and that is what made it so dangerous. Somewhere inside that atmosphere of fatigue, vanity, and quiet corruption, a man appeared who understood something most people never do. The bigger the lie, the more carefully people protect themselves from seeing it. Not because they are stupid, because admitting the lie would force them to confront something worse, their own greed, their own fear, their own willingness to believe what should never have made sense in the first place. He understood that before Paris did. He understood that before his victims did. And by the time anyone saw the shape of what was happening, he was already inside the room. Victor Lustig did not look like the kind of criminal history warns you about. He looked composed, educated, controlled. The kind of man who seemed more likely to sign a government directive than flee from one. He spoke with the calm assurance of someone who belonged among powerful people, and that mattered more than almost anything else. In a world obsessed with class, credentials, and appearances, confidence could function like a passport. Sometimes it was stronger than the truth. But Lustig was not just a con man moving through Europe's upper circles. He was something more precise, a predator of systems. He did not simply steal money. He studied weakness, vanity, procedure, delay. He watched how officials behaved when they wanted secrecy. He watched how businessmen behaved when they smelled profit. Then he built his traps, where those instincts overlapped. That alone would have made him dangerous. But then the story takes a darker turn, because this was not just about one man fooling one victim. It was about a city ready to be deceived, a government culture thick with private arrangements, businessmen desperate to rise, men who wanted a fortune but wanted it quietly, men who could not go to the police without first explaining why they had been in the room at all. That was the real opening, not the tower. The silence around the tower. And once you see that, the whole story changes. This was never just a trick. It was a psychological operation built on humiliation, status, and the weapon no one ever talks about in public scandals until it is too late. Shame. Because Lustig understood a brutal law of power. If you choose the right victim, you do not need to stop them from speaking. They will silence themselves. That is where the danger deepens. The Eiffel Tower was not some forgotten asset buried in a ledger. It was one of the most recognizable structures on the planet. To do anything with it would require nerve beyond reason, or access, or both. Yet somehow, whispers began to circulate through a very particular class of men. Scrap metal dealers, industrial buyers. People who knew that enormous public structures did not last forever, and that when governments made discreet decisions, fortunes could be made by those invited in early. Invited. That was the word that changed everything. Because suddenly this impossible idea no longer arrived like a fantasy. It arrived like an opportunity. Private, confidential, sensitive. The kind of matter governments handled carefully to avoid public backlash. The kind of matter that rewarded men willing to act before the rest of the market caught up. And once that frame was in place, disbelief became a liability. A man who hesitated could lose everything. A man who questioned too loudly might expose that he did not belong in the room. So the trap was already working before anyone signed anything. All Lustig needed now was the perfect setting, the right symbols of authority, and a victim whose ambition outweighed his caution by just enough. Not a fool, never a fool. Someone intelligent enough to appreciate the prize, insecure enough to chase it, and proud enough to hide the mistake afterward. He found that man. And when the meeting was arranged, it did not feel like a crime. It felt like an ascent, a private invitation into the machinery of the state, an extraordinary chance, a fortune wrapped in discretion. Everything about it was designed to make one thing feel more dangerous than being deceived: missing out. That was the pressure point. Not force, not threats, not desperation, prestige. Soon, one businessman would step into a room believing he was about to secure the deal of a lifetime. He had no idea he was walking into one of the most audacious frauds in modern history. The man Lustig chose was not poor, not reckless, not naive in any simple sense. That is what makes this story so unsettling. The victim was a businessman in the scrap metal trade, a man positioned close enough to real deals to recognize their scent, but not high enough to feel secure among the elites who controlled them. He was exactly the kind of man who spent his life trying to move one level higher. And Lustig knew it. So he did not approach him in a back alley or a cafe filled with shadows. He approached him through the language of the state, official correspondence, formal invitations, quiet urgency, the kind of communication that flatters a man before it traps him. Soon, a select group of dealers received word that they were being considered for a confidential government transaction involving a structure that had become inconvenient, expensive, and politically delicate, the Eiffel Tower. Even then, the lie was not revealed all at once. That was the genius of it. Lustig did not ask anyone to believe the impossible in a single step. He built a staircase of plausibility. First came the atmosphere of secrecy. Then the explanation that public reaction would be explosive if the matter became known too soon. Then the suggestion that only a handful of trusted businessmen had been invited to compete. Every layer solved a doubt before the victim could fully feel it. By the time the dealers met him, disbelief had already been weakened. And Lustig understood another thing about power. Most people do not judge authority by truth. They judge it by texture. The room, the paper, the tone, the setting. He arranged the encounter in a luxury hotel, a place that did half the lying for him. Surrounded by wealth, polished service, and official-sounding language, the scam began to feel less like fantasy and more like insider access. That was the shift that mattered. The tower was not being sold in public. It was being disposed of quietly. That one distinction changed everything. Now the dealers were not being asked to imagine a mad theft. They were being invited into an uncomfortable act of state housekeeping. The Eiffel Tower, they were told, had become too costly to maintain. Its public image was too sensitive. The government wanted discretion. That explanation was outrageous, but not impossible. And in an era where public institutions often concealed their embarrassment behind bureaucracy, it had just enough truth around the edges to live. That is how the mechanism began to function beneath the surface, not through force, through emotional calibration. Lustig gave each victim a version of reality they were prepared to accept, then let their own ambition carry them the rest of the way. But one man reacted differently. Among the invited dealers, one stood out. André Poisson was eager, ambitious, and painfully aware that he had not yet fully entered the inner ranks of Parisian business society. He had money, but not pedigree, opportunity, but not status. Men like that often live with a quiet wound. They are successful enough to want more, and insecure enough to believe one decisive victory will finally make them untouchable. Lustig saw that wound immediately, so the scam evolved. This was no longer just a fake government sale. It became something more intimate, more poisonous. Lustig began to hint that the process was not as clean as it appeared. He played the role of a weary public official, underpaid, burdened, and receptive to private understanding. In other words, corrupt. Not openly, never crudely. Just enough to signal that this was how serious business was really done behind respectable curtains. And suddenly the deal felt even more real, because corruption, perversely, made the lie believable. That is the detail that gives this story its edge. If Lustig had acted too noble, Poisson might have doubted him. But by suggesting he expected a personal inducement, a discreet payment to smooth the decision, Lustig transformed himself into something far more convincing than an honest official. He became a familiar one, a man of the system, a man who could be bought. And Poisson, rather than recoiling, leaned closer, because now the transaction no longer felt theatrical. It felt dirty, private, risky, which meant it felt authentic. He was not just buying scrap rights. He was buying access to the invisible rules of power. He was crossing a threshold. That was the real sale. Not iron. Belonging. So Poisson made his move. He paid. Not only for the supposed rights connected to dismantling the Eiffel Tower, but for the privilege of becoming the man chosen from the shadows. In his mind, he had not been fooled. He had finally arrived. He had outmaneuvered rivals, navigated secrecy, and done what serious men did when huge deals were kept away from the public eye. Then the silence began. No crews arrived. No state confirmation followed. No machinery moved toward the tower, and somewhere inside that silence, the truth started taking shape. Lustig was gone. The documents were worthless. The authority was invented. The invitation had been a trap designed with surgical precision around a single human weakness. Poisson had not purchased a fortune. He had purchased his own humiliation, and that humiliation mattered more than the money, because it created the final barrier that protected Lustig after the theft was complete. Poisson did not rush to the police. That was the most devastating part. He stayed quiet, because to report the crime he would have to confess everything. That he believed the Eiffel Tower could be sold in secret, that he paid an apparent official under the table, that he was not merely deceived, but compromised. Lustig had not only taken his money, he had taken his ability to speak without destroying himself. And for a moment, the impossible happened. It worked. Victor Lustig had sold the Eiffel Tower, but the deeper pressure was only beginning to build, because this should have been enough for any ordinary criminal. One impossible victory, one clean escape. one vanishing act into another country before the lie collapsed behind him. Lustig was not ordinary, and what he did next turned an outrageous fraud into something far more chilling. Most criminals disappear after one success. They take the money, cross a border, invent a new name, and spend the rest of their lives trying not to tempt fate a second time. Victor Lustig looked at one of the boldest cons of the 20th century and made a different calculation. He realized his victim had done exactly what he hoped. He had remained silent. No police stormed across the newspapers. No public scandal erupted through Paris. No official statement exposed the fraud. The city kept moving. The tower still stood. And the silence told Lustig something almost unbelievable. The scheme had not merely succeeded. It had succeeded so completely that the victim was helping conceal it. That changed everything, because once silence becomes part of the machinery, the crime is no longer over. It becomes repeatable. So Lustig came back. That is the detail that pushes this story out of the realm of clever deception and into something darker. Selling the Eiffel Tower once was outrageous. Trying to sell it again meant he believed he understood the human weakness beneath the surface better than the institutions meant to defend against him, and in a way he did. He understood that embarrassment could be stronger than law, that pride could be stronger than evidence, that a man desperate to appear sophisticated would often cooperate with his own destruction. He returned to Paris and rebuilt the illusion. Again, the letters went out. Again, the discreet invitations. Again, the language of confidential state business. Again, the suggestion that the government needed trusted industrial buyers to handle a politically explosive disposal. The same impossible proposition was dressed in the same plausible costume, because the costume had worked. Authority, secrecy, private access, implied corruption. It was less a lie than a ritual, and rituals are powerful. They tell people how to feel before they know what to think. This time, however, the city pushed back. Somewhere in that second cycle, suspicion surfaced. Maybe one potential victim had sharper instincts. Maybe the emotional balance shifted too far. Maybe Lustig, emboldened by the first success, pressed his luck half a step beyond what the performance could carry. Whatever happened, the silence fractured. Authorities began to stir. The room that had once belonged entirely to him no longer felt sealed. So Lustig fled. Again. And that escape reveals something important about the deeper mechanism behind the scam. The fraud was never really about forged documents alone, or costumes, or elegant hotels, or fake titles. Those were tools. The real engine was timing. Lustig entered moments when reality felt unstable enough that absurdity could hide inside official process. He moved through the cracks between public trust and private cynicism. He knew that when people believe governments are both powerful and corrupt, they will accept almost any contradiction, as long as it is wrapped in secrecy. That is why the public failed to see it in time. Because the story sounded insane when spoken plainly. But it did not arrive plainly. It arrived piece by piece, through people already conditioned to believe that the most important decisions happened somewhere they were not allowed to see. By the time the lie was visible, it had already passed through pride, greed, and shame. And once that happens, exposure becomes difficult. Every victim becomes a witness against himself. That pattern followed Lustig far beyond Paris. The Eiffel Tower scam made him infamous later, but it was part of a much larger method. He did not survive by inventing one masterpiece. He survived by studying desire. He could sit in front of wealthy men, watch them for minutes, and identify the exact mixture of vanity and hunger that made them vulnerable. Some wanted easy money. Some wanted status. Some wanted the thrill of entering forbidden rooms where real power was supposedly exercised. Lustig gave each of them a story in which their flaw looked like sophistication. And that is why they walked forward. Not because they were irrational, because they mistook corruption for realism. That moral reversal sits at the center of the whole affair. The victims were not destroyed by innocence. They were destroyed by worldliness. They wanted to believe they had graduated beyond ordinary rules, that they now understood how serious men did business in the dark. Lustig let them feel clever right until the moment their cleverness became evidence against them. Then he vanished. But even vanishing has limits. Men like Lustig can outrun victims. They can outrun jurisdictions. They can outrun scandal for a while. What they cannot outrun forever is escalation. Every successful deception changes the deceiver. It breeds confidence, then appetite, then carelessness. The performance gets smoother, but the risk gets larger. And eventually the same brilliance that made the fraud possible begins to demand a bigger stage. That happened to Lustig too. His path carried him into new cons, new identities, new countries, and eventually into the United States, where he expanded beyond theatrical fraud into a wider criminal life. He forged, manipulated, exploited. And somewhere along that road, the elegant social engineer who once weaponized embarrassment against ambitious businessmen moved closer to the hard machinery of organized crime and federal pursuit. The stakes were no longer just humiliation and private losses. They were prison, manhunts, and national attention. The illusion was thinning, not all at once, not dramatically, slowly. A forged world can survive on charm for years, but eventually it runs into systems that do not feel shame the way individual victims do. A businessman may stay silent to protect his pride. A state can absorb embarrassment and keep hunting. Once that transition begins, the con artist faces a different enemy, not disbelief, documentation, coordination, memory. And when those forces finally started closing around Victor Lustig, the man who had sold a monument by manipulating silence was forced into a final confrontation with institutions far less vulnerable to social embarrassment than the men he once studied so carefully. By then, the legend was already larger than the facts. But the facts were enough. A man had convinced respectable businessmen that one of the most famous structures on Earth could be quietly sold for scrap. He had done it by impersonating authority, exploiting corruption, and turning shame into a shield. He had even tried to do it again. And now, after years of reinvention, escape, and deception, the system he mocked was finally moving toward him. The performance was almost over. By the time Victor Lustig's career finally began to collapse, the Eiffel Tower scam had already become something larger than a crime. It had become a warning, not just about fraud, but about the people and systems that make fraud possible. Because Lustig did not conquer Paris with force. He conquered it with performance. He found the distance between how power looked and how power actually worked, and he lived inside that gap. In the end, he did not fall because the world suddenly became honest. He fell because his ambitions kept expanding. The lies grew wider, the pressure grew heavier, and eventually, even a man built from reinvention runs out of exits. In the United States, after years of deception, counterfeiting, and constant movement, federal authorities closed in. The man who had once manipulated private shame so expertly was dragged into a system that no longer cared about preserving his dignity. He was arrested, prosecuted, and sent into the machinery he had spent his life evading. He died in prison, not as a king of thieves, not as a mastermind still laughing from some distant coast, but as something far more revealing. A man who understood human weakness so well that he mistook that knowledge for invincibility. And yet, the real damage was never limited to the money he stole. The businessmen he deceived lost cash, yes. Some lost reputations they could never openly defend. But the deeper theft was psychological. Lustig forced his victims into a position where telling the truth would expose their vanity, their greed, and their willingness to participate in corruption if they believed it would elevate them. He did not just rob them, he turned them into accomplices in their own silence. That is why this story still feels modern, because the mechanism never disappeared. The details changed. The documents became emails. The luxury hotel became encrypted calls, private investor rooms, exclusive networks, closed briefings, artificial urgency. But the core remained the same. Make the target feel chosen. Make the deal feel confidential. Make doubt feel unsophisticated. Make secrecy feel like status. And above all, make the victim believe that speaking up will cost more than staying quiet. That is how impossible things keep happening in full view of intelligent people. Victor Lustig did not sell iron. He sold access. He sold prestige. He sold the fantasy that behind every public system there is a hidden door, and that only a select few are clever enough to walk through it. That fantasy has destroyed fortunes for centuries. And it still does. Because every age believes it is too advanced to be fooled the old way. But the old way was never really old. It was human. Greed dressed as sophistication, corruption dressed as realism, silence dressed as self-protection. Lustig saw that clearly. More clearly, perhaps, than many of the respectable men who thought they were doing business with him. That is the sharpest lesson buried inside the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. Fraud does not always begin with ignorance. Sometimes it begins with ambition, with insecurity, with the desire to be admitted into rooms where rules are bent and fortunes are made before the public knows what happened. And when enough people want that badly enough, even the most absurd lie can start to feel like privileged information. That is how a monument can be sold. Twice. Not because the structure was weak, because the people around it were. To understand the future of money, we must first understand its past. Subscribe to uncover the truth.